My father's laughter rolled through the grand ballroom like thunder under the chandeliers. 200 guests, executives, investors, family friends joined in their polite chuckles bouncing off the marble walls. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. The air smelled of expensive champagne and old money. Dad lifted his glass, proud and powerful, basking in applause. Then the hotel manager approached our table, bowed slightly, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Ma'am, your staff is ready for your instructions." And in that instant, every laugh died. The chandeliers shimmered above us like crystal witnesses. For a second, I could hear nothing but the clinking of ice in a nearby glass. My father's face froze mid-smirk, confusion flickering across his eyes, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Your staff," he repeated, his voice breaking the silence. "Yes," I said softly, turning toward the manager. "Please make sure the conference hall is prepared for tomorrow's walkthrough. The Bloom Nest team will arrive at 8. The manager nodded. "Of course, Ms. Grant." Ms. Grant. Not Olivia, not the daughter who failed to fit the family mold. And that title, spoken so naturally, cracked the room open like a storm. Dad blinked, his hand tightening around his wine glass. You're working with the hotel," he asked, his tone carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp. I gave him the same calm, deliberate smile I reserved for the most hostile board meetings. "Not working with," I said. "Working on. The Astoria Regent is part of our latest eco-restoration project." The word "our" hung heavy in the air. To anyone else, it sounded ordinary. Just another deal, another contract. But to my father, Harold Grant, founder of Grant & Sons Development Group, it was sacrilege. Because this hotel, the crown jewel of the city's skyline, was where his company once tried and failed to win a multi-million-dollar renovation bid. A deal my firm later secured. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The look on his face said enough. 2 hours earlier, I had promised myself I would behave. Smile, applaud, say congratulations, and leave quietly. This was his night after all his retirement party, after 40 years of ruling both the boardroom and family like an empire. But when I walked into the ballroom, I already felt out of place. The air was thick with ego and nostalgia, the kind of celebration that smelled of expensive scotch and self-importance. Gold letters across the entrance banner read, "Celebrating Harold Grant, a man who built the city." And there I was, the daughter he always believed built nothing. Michael and Ethan, my brothers, stood beside him near the stage, perfectly groomed, raising glasses, as people congratulated the heirs of Grant & Sons. When I approached, Dad gave me a brief half-hug like I was a polite stranger. "Olivia, glad you made it," he said, adjusting his tie. "I wasn't sure you'd have time given your gardening company." "Design company," I corrected quietly. He grinned. "Of course. Design. Of gardens." Michael snickered, hiding it behind a sip of champagne. I could have walked out then. But I didn't, because I'd learned that silence, not anger, was my sharpest weapon. Dinner was served in silver dishes, waiters gliding like choreography. Conversations hummed around mergers, market trends, and yachts. My brothers traded business jargon with Dad's former colleagues, while I sat quietly at the end of the table, my name tag slightly misplaced. Halfway through dessert, the speeches began. Michael went first, full of practiced charm. "Dad taught us everything about leadership," he said. "He showed us what real business looks like." Applause, toasts, laughter. Then Dad stood, microphone in hand, basking in the light of his own myth. 40 years, he began, his deep voice steady. "I started with a blueprint and a dream. Built towers that touch the clouds. And I'm proud to say my sons will carry that legacy forward." He raised his glass toward them. Cameras flashed. My brothers smiled, glowing under his approval. Then, as if he couldn't resist one more jab, his gaze drifted down the table to me. "And Olivia," he said with an indulgent smile. "She's doing her own thing. Some kind of eco-art studio." Laughter rippled across the table. "Doing that tiny business and calling it a company," he added. "When will you ever make money?" The word sliced through me, sharp but familiar. The same tone he'd used since I was 16, the amused superiority of a man who believed he built empires while I built fantasies. I placed my napkin on my lap, lifted my glass, and smiled. Some dreams take time to pay off, Dad. He chuckled. Some never do. The table laughed again. And then silence. The manager appeared. Ma'am, he said, bowing slightly beside me, your staff is ready for your instructions regarding the morning inspection. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then he added, the Bloom Nest project files have been delivered to the executive suite as you requested. It was like time had stopped. I caught the subtle shift in the air, the dawning realization spreading across faces. My brothers froze mid-breath. A cousin's fork clattered against porcelain. Dad's voice came out slow, uncertain. You own this hotel? I turned my gaze on him, calm, deliberate. Not this one, I said. All 6 of them. A low murmur rippled through the guests. Someone whispered, Bloom Nest. Another said, isn't that the firm from the Forbes feature last month? And then like dominoes, the truth sank in. Dad's jaw tightened. I watched pride drain from his expression, replaced by something raw confusion, disbelief, maybe even fear. I leaned closer, my tone gentle. You once told me I'd never understand real business, I said. But it turns out, I was building something you couldn't see. The manager nodded once more, waiting. I handed him a brief smile. Tell the staff I'll meet them in the boardroom at 8. He bowed and walked off. No one spoke. The chandeliers glittered above, catching the reflection of a man suddenly stripped of his certainty. Across the table, Ethan shifted uncomfortably, whispering something to Michael. Dad's hand trembled slightly as he set his glass down. Olivia, he said finally, his voice rough, we'll talk later. Of course, I replied. I'll have my assistant schedule it. That line, the one I'd rehearsed for years, landed like a final nail. As the room slowly returned to motion, I rose from the table. Every step felt like a lifetime's worth of swallowed pride turning solid under my heels. I could feel eyes on me, curious, incredulous, some even admiring. But I didn't turn back. Outside in the quiet corridor lined with mirrors and golden sconces, I exhaled the breath I'd been holding for 33 years. That night under those chandeliers, my father's empire ended and mine quietly began. But this wasn't just about revenge. It never was. It was about the years that led here, the rejections, the laughter, the endless need to prove I was more than a punchline. Let me tell you how my tiny company began, and why my father never saw it coming. When I was 8, I learned what being less felt like. Our dining table was a slab of marble as cold as my father's voice. He sat at the head, flanked by my brothers Michael and Ethan, discussing profit margins and quarterly growth, like they were reciting gospel. I'd spent all week reading one of his business magazines, circling words I didn't understand, so I could ask him later. That night when I finally asked what liquidity meant, he laughed a deep dismissive sound that made the chandelier tremble. Sweetheart, why don't you help your mother with dessert? This is business talk, the men chuckled. My mother still went. That laughter stayed with me longer than any punishment ever could. Back then, we lived in Boston in a 3-story townhouse overlooking the river. Grant & Sons development was growing fast, and my father was gone most nights dining with investors or touring construction sites. When he was home, the air shifted. My brothers, 3 and 5 years older, competed for his attention like trained soldiers. They'd stand taller, talk louder, eager to be noticed. And they always were. My mother. Margaret was everything my father wasn't: soft-spoken, artistic, a literature teacher who believed beauty was a kind of intelligence. She had an old oak desk covered with sketches and color pencils, a world apart from my father's office full of blueprints and steel models. Whenever his voice filled the house, hers became quieter. I remember once showing him a drawing I'd made: a 2-story house surrounded by trees, sunlight flooding through glass walls. I'd written, "For people who want to breathe inside." He looked at it for 2 seconds and said, "Cute. But we build towers, not dollhouses." He handed it back like it was a napkin. That night my mother came to my room, her robe smelling faintly of paint and jasmine. She sat on the edge of my bed and whispered, "Your father builds with steel. You build with soul. Don't ever let him convince you they're the same thing." Our home felt like 2 worlds stitched together by tension. His office cold full of numbers floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected only himself. Her studio warm, messy, full of light. And I lived between them, always forced to choose which world I belonged to. At 12, I entered the state science fair with a model city built from recycled cardboard miniature wind turbines, solar panels, and rooftop gardens. I won first place. My mother was there clapping, tears shining in her eyes. My father wasn't. He'd gone to Michael's basketball game instead, even though Michael sat on the bench the entire time. He sent flowers afterward, white lilies, my mother's favorite, not mine. The card was typed, not signed. Proud of you, Dad. That was the night I learned silence could hurt more than shouting. By the time I turned 16, my mother was gone. Breast cancer took her faster than anyone could understand. During her funeral, while people murmured condolences, I overheard my father speaking to one of his associates near the entrance. "At least my sons will carry on the business," he said quietly, as if I couldn't hear him. That's what matters in the end. I remember gripping the hem of my black dress so tightly the seams tore. My mother's coffin was still open then. I didn't cry. I just looked at her and thought, he doesn't even realize what he's losing. After she died, everything hardened. The house became a shrine to my father's legacy portraits of him, cutting ribbons, shaking hands, standing beside cranes and skyscrapers. The warmth my mother brought disappeared with her. And I, the daughter she'd called her dreamer, became an inconvenience, a reminder of everything that didn't fit his blueprint. When college applications came around, I told him I'd been accepted into the architecture program at MIT. He didn't even look up from his laptop. "Architecture," he said. "That's art. No Grant has ever been an artist." "It's not art," I said quietly. "It's design. It's structure and purpose." He smiled without warmth. "Call it whatever you want. It's not business." I could have taken the easy route, joined Grant & Sons, let him groom me for some meaningless creative consultant role. Instead, I took the scholarship and left Boston. The morning I moved into my dorm, he stood by the car, hands in his pockets, and said, "You'll be back in a year. Once the dream wears off." I remember thinking, maybe. But if I come back, it'll be because I built something worth coming home for. MIT was everything my father wasn't: collaborative, curious, alive. For the first time, my ideas weren't cute. They were celebrated. My professors pushed me to think about sustainability, urban impact, and community spaces. I built models from recycled materials, experimented with living walls and rooftop gardens. Each project felt like a small rebellion against the man who taught me that concrete was the only measure of success. Still, even at my graduation, he managed to turn pride into dismissal. He arrived 20 minutes late, missed my speech, and left before the ceremony ended. His excuse: "Your brothers have a lunch meeting with potential investors." The investors turned out to be 2 middle managers at one of his subsidiaries. That night, I sat alone in my dorm room, cap and gown still on, and replayed his words in my head, "You'll be back." But I didn't go back. I couldn't. When the acceptance email came for an internship in New York, I didn't even tell him. I packed my things, left Boston behind, and moved into a tiny studio apartment that smelled like paint and potential. On my first night there, I took out my mother's old sketchbook, the one she'd left me in her will. Inside the cover, she'd written in her looping handwriting, "When the world builds walls, plant something that grows higher." I ran my fingers over those words until the ink smudged. Then I opened my laptop and started drafting my first freelance design, an eco-friendly rooftop cafe that would later become the seed for my company. As dawn broke over the city skyline, I whispered to the air, to her, to the memory of that marble table where I was once told to fetch dessert, "One day I'll build something he can't ignore." I didn't know how, or when, or what it would cost. But I knew this much: even the smallest seeds can break through concrete. "Your little green project won't last 6 months, my father said the day I quit my corporate job. He was wrong. It didn't last 6 months, it barely lasted 3. The first investor backed out, the landlord locked the office door, and my co-founder left. Everyone called Bloom Nest a failure. But I wasn't ready to die quietly. My father might have built an empire, but I was about to build a revolution. After graduating, I took a position at Henderson Urban Design. I spent 3 years designing lobbies and facades for luxury condos. My ideas for green rooftop communities were politely ignored. The breaking point came during a pitch meeting. The senior architect laughed. "Clients don't pay for trees, sweetheart. They pay for glass and profit." I drafted my resignation. I started Nest Studios out of a cramped attic in Brooklyn. My savings barely covered 2 months of rent. My first teammate was Sophie Tran, brilliant and nearly as broke as I was. Our first client was a small coffee shop. They paid $600 for a vertical garden. We posted it online. Small spaces, big change. The post went viral, but every step forward came with 3 steps back: unpaid invoices and delays. I waited tables at night to keep the lights on. My father sent an email: "I heard your company is still alive. You can come back to Grant & Sons anytime." I printed it, pinned it to the wall: "Make something he can't laugh at." The words became a mantra. Survival itself was a victory. Then came the Urban Design Forum. When I saw my father's name on the program, my stomach twisted. After my presentation, Harold Grant stood up. "Maybe my daughter will decorate one of our real buildings someday." I forced a smile. "One day your buildings might ask for mine to keep them alive." A business blog ran the headline, "Heiress of Grant Empire Pushes Eco-Design Dream." The comments were brutal. Sophie slammed her laptop shut. "Let them laugh. Flowers bloom in silence." Weeks later, an email arrived from a small hospital in Vermont. They wanted a rehabilitation garden for cancer patients. The budget was $45,000. We designed courtyards where patients could walk barefoot. The first day, an elderly woman hugged me. "It feels like hope grew here." The story caught attention. The Boston Herald ran an article titled, "Nest Studios Brings Life Back to Recovery Spaces." For the first time, my phone rang with opportunities. I whispered into the quiet, "You built towers, Dad. I'll build places that make people breathe again." "They call it a tiny company," I said to no one. "I call it the beginning." When the hospital garden finally opened, I thought my father might call. He didn't. But when the Boston Herald ran the headline, "Nest Studios Brings Life Back to Recovery Spaces," my phone rang anyway. It wasn't him. It was a man named Connor Wells, CEO of Wells Development. "I saw your design," he said, voice confident yet warm. "You're exactly what this city needs." For a moment I stared out my studio window at the skyline my father once ruled and whispered, "Then let's build something he can't ignore." The Vermont Hospital project had started as a desperate gamble. They wanted a garden, I needed a miracle. But the results were undeniable. Patients healed faster, staff morale improved, and a local news segment featured our work under the title, "When Architecture Heals." For the first time, Nest Studios wasn't just surviving, it was being noticed. Connor's call came 2 weeks later. He spoke like a man used to making things happen. "You believe in buildings that give back," he said. "I believe in developers who stop destroying what's around them. Let's meet." We met at a cafe in Midtown. He arrived in a charcoal suit, sleeves rolled up, the picture of efficiency, but with an ease that disarmed me. Over coffee, he said, "You're not building gardens. You're building longevity, the kind investors only pretend to understand." "I'm building spaces that breathe," I replied. "But investors prefer walls that suffocate." He smiled. "Then you need better investors." Connor was different from the men my father surrounded himself with. He listened without interrupting, asking about materials, energy systems, how natural light shaped emotion. When I mentioned my firm's struggles, he said simply, "I can help." He didn't just talk. A week later, he wired a modest investment, $100,000. It wasn't fortune-changing, but it was validation. With his contacts and reputation, Nest began to appear in circles far above its size. The media picked up on it fast. Modern Architecture Monthly ran a profile titled, "The Woman Redefining Urban Spaces." They used a photo of me standing beside a vertical garden wall, sunlight hitting my face. The caption read, "Olivia Grant, founder of Bloomnest Studios, believes cities can breathe again." The article spread across LinkedIn, architectural blogs, even a local TV segment. I should have been thrilled, and I was, until the quotes from my father appeared 2 days later. "We're proud of Olivia," he sniped at a journalist. "She's found a hobby she enjoys. It's not real business, but it keeps her busy." A hobby. Sophie burst into my office waving the article. "He called your company a hobby?" I forced a smile. "That's generous." "He used to call it a mistake." But that night, as I stared at the glowing city through my apartment window, the words settled like dust. He'd never stop seeing me as small. I wrote on my whiteboard in bold black marker, "They call it a hobby. I'll turn it into an empire." Connor noticed the fire in me the next morning. "You've got that look," he said, sipping his espresso. "The one that builds skylines." "Or burn them down," I replied. He laughed softly. "Same energy, different outcome." A few months later, he invited me to dinner at the Newberry Hotel, one of Manhattan's oldest luxury landmarks. I hesitated at first. I wasn't used to settings where the napkins cost more than my rent. But when I arrived, he was already there, seated beneath the golden chandelier, exuding effortless control. "This place," he said, glancing around, "has history, but no future. It's dying in style. Someday someone will buy it and turn it into something that matters." I smiled. "Maybe someone already is." He raised his glass. "Then here's to quiet revolutions." That dinner became a turning point. Connor didn't just believe in me, he believed in what Bloomnest stood for. He introduced me to urban investors seeking sustainable projects. With each new connection, I learned to walk into rooms where I once felt invisible and leave with people remembering my name. But success has a way of echoing back to places you don't want it to. At the next Grant & Sons board meeting, my father reportedly laughed when someone mentioned Bloomnest. "The media loves charity work," he said. "Let her decorate rooftops. Real money's still in steel." Michael, always eager to please, added, "Her designs are cute. Investors don't build on feelings." Ethan, the quieter brother, didn't say a word. That night, a reporter emailed me asking for a comment on my father's remarks. I stared at the screen before replying simply, "Cute things have a way of growing when no one's watching." The quote went viral. Blogs titled it, "The Daughter Who Dared to Answer Back." Connor laughed. "You've just declared war," he said. "No," I corrected, he did. "I'm just showing up for the battle." Within months, our partnership on the Green Horizon Residences project gained traction. It was a bold concept, entire apartment blocks powered by solar panels, rooftop farms, and recycled water systems. Investors were skeptical at first, but the success of our Vermont project gave me credibility. For the first time, Bloomnest wasn't the small firm begging for attention. It was the future knocking on the door of an old empire. Then came the counterattack. Grant & Sons announced a massive new skyscraper in Midtown Titan Tower. A sterile monument of glass and steel. The same plot of land I had once proposed for a community green park in my student days. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a declaration. A journalist called to ask, "Do you see Grant & Sons as competition?" I didn't hesitate. Competition implies equality. By morning, the quote was everywhere. My father's silence on it was louder than any response. Connor found me in my office later that day. "You know he'll come after you now," he said. "He already did," I replied. "I'm still standing." He grinned. "Then keep building." When he left, I stood by the window watching the city pulse beneath me. The same skyline my father thought he owned. The same streets that once made me feel small. Now they looked different, like possibilities waiting for roots. That evening, a courier delivered a thick ivory envelope. Inside was an invitation embossed with gold Grant & Sons' 40-year celebration and Harold Grant's retirement gala. I held it for a moment, feeling the weight of every insult, every dismissal, every time he'd said I was playing business. Then I smiled. Maybe I'd go. After all, he wanted a celebration. and I was finally ready to give him one worth remembering. The night I got the email from Horizon Global, I thought it was spam. The subject line read, Proposal Sustainable Hospitality. Partnership Inquiry. I hovered my cursor over it, half expecting it to be another rejection disguised as regret. But when I opened it, my world shifted in a single paragraph. Ms. Grant, it began. We followed Bloomnest's work on the Coastal Revival Project. We're expanding our luxury hotel division with a focus on sustainability. Let's talk about partnership. I read it 3 times, my pulse quickening. Horizon Global wasn't just any company, it was the company my father had courted for years to collaborate with Grant & Sons. They'd rejected him, calling his methods outdated, his buildings eco-ignorant. And now they wanted me. I sat there in my tiny office, lit by the soft glow of a single desk lamp surrounded by sketches and prototypes. It was the biggest professional validation I had ever received. Within 48 hours, I was on a flight to Chicago. Across from me sat Claire Thompson, their CEO, a woman with sharp eyes and a calm presence. We want to acquire a majority stake in Bloomnest. 51%, Claire stated. 51%. The number hung in the air like a test. A lifetime of my father's voice echoed in my head. Always take the deal if it gets you more power. I appreciate the offer, I said finally, but Bloomnest was built to prove that small doesn't mean insignificant. If I sell majority control, I'd lose that. Claire studied me, then smiled faintly. How about 49%? That's when I realized she wasn't just testing me. She respected me. When I got back to New York, I called my father. Bloomnest is entering a partnership with Horizon Global. He chuckled. So they're buying you out? No, I said evenly. They're joining us. He laughed harder, unable to believe I retained control. 2 weeks later, Bloomnest's name appeared on the front page of Business Today, the tiny company that's redefining luxury hospitality. The article mentioned the upcoming renovation of the Astoria Regent, the same hotel where my father's company had once failed to secure a deal. One evening, as the sun bled over the skyline, I received a message from Horizon's internal team, urgent. We've decided to host the formal partnership signing ceremony at the Astoria Regent Hotel. I stared at the screen, then laughed softly. The Astoria Regent. The same hotel. The one where my father had publicly mocked me months earlier. The irony was perfect. The night before the ceremony, I stood in the lobby surrounded by solar chandeliers. My chandeliers. The air smelled of renewal. My phone buzzed. See you at the ceremony tomorrow. Dad. He was coming. Tomorrow, under those same chandeliers, I would face him again, not as the daughter who failed, but as the woman who now owned the hotel he once dreamed of. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the ballroom was the cold. Not the temperature, but the kind that comes from polished surfaces and judgmental eyes. Crystal chandeliers floated above white-draped tables, their light refracted into thousands of tiny fragments, like the pieces of myself I'd spent years putting back together. My heels clicked against marble as I moved past a line of executives shaking hands, champagne glasses glinting like small weapons. The sign at the entrance read, Honoring Harold Grant, 40 years of excellence. 40 years. 40 years of him being the sun and the rest of us orbiting around his gravity. Tonight was supposed to be his farewell. I didn't yet know it would also be his reckoning. Sophie appeared from the crowd, elegant in a navy gown that matched mine, her expression already apologetic. They've seated you at table 14, she murmured. I forced a smile. Let me guess, near the kitchen, close, she said softly. Behind the pillar. Across the room I spotted my brothers. Michael and Ethan stood flanking our father at the head table, like twin sentinels of approval. My father's suit was a deep charcoal, his tie, silver the color of confidence. He looked every inch the empire builder the world thought he was. And yet when his gaze swept across the room and landed on me, there was that familiar flicker of something else amusement. He raised his glass slightly, the gesture polished, meaningless. I raised mine in return and drank. The band started playing soft jazz as waiters moved like shadows between tables. The hum of conversation filled the space, deals being discussed, promotions hinted at, alliances maintained. I heard snippets everywhere. Michael's expanding into real estate finance. Ethan's taking over regional operations. And Olivia, someone asked. A shrug. She runs that little eco thing. Cute, isn't it? Sophie's hand brushed mine under the table. Breathe, she whispered. I smiled thinly. Oh, I am. I'm just trying not to choke on irony. Connor arrived late, of course. My partner, equal parts calm and storm, slid into the seat beside me just as the main course was being served. His tux was slightly rumpled, his tie loose, the picture of casual rebellion. Traffic, he murmured, leaning close. How's the circus performing as expected? He studied my face for a moment, reading the tension there. Are you sure you want to stay? Yes, I said. Because when the curtain falls, I want to see it happen. The dinner stretched on heavy with small talk and hollow laughter. Every time a guest passed our table, they offered the same polite condescension. He must be so proud of you, one woman said, adjusting her diamond bracelet. Of course, I replied, smiling sweetly. He reminds me every chance he gets. Dessert arrived, raspberry tarts and coffee served in delicate porcelain. The program coordinator approached the stage, tapping the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, if we could have your attention for a few moments. It's time to honor a man whose name is synonymous with success, leadership, and vision, Mr. Harold Grant. Applause erupted like thunder. My father rose from his chair, face illuminated by the spotlight. He looked taller than he was, fed by the energy of admiration. Michael clapped him on the back. Ethan whispered something that made him smile. Then he adjusted his tie, the same gesture he always made before saying something he wanted to remember. The lights dimmed as a video montage played on the massive screen behind him. Scenes of construction sites, boardrooms, ribbon cuttings. My father shakes hands with mayors, governors, and investors. Then the family section, photos of him coaching my brother's baseball games, attending their graduations, smiling beside them at ribbon ceremonies. I appear once. A single frame. Age 10, standing next to him in a family portrait, half hidden behind my mother's shoulder. The guests murmured appreciation as the video ended. I felt Sophie's hand tighten around mine. It's fine, I whispered. But it wasn't. When the applause finally subsided, my father took the podium. Thank you, he began, his voice smooth, commanding. 40 years, it feels strange even saying it. I built my first property before my first gray hair. Back then, all I had was ambition and a loan from a friend. Now, he gestured grandly around the room, now we have a legacy. The word hung in the air like incense. He spoke of his company's milestones, the skyscrapers that defined city skylines, the contracts that shaped economies. Guests nodded reverently as if his every sentence carried divine weight. I watched him, expression unreadable, knowing what was coming. He turned slightly, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder. These boys have made me proud. Michael, who's taken the firm global. Ethan, who's turned risk into opportunity. He paused for applause. It came loud and eager, and of course he continued, my daughter Olivia. The crowd turned toward me. I braced. Who decided to explore other interests? Laughter rippled through the room. He smiled, savoring it. She's doing that eco-business thing. A boutique company. You know, the kind of passion project people start when they don't need to worry about payroll. More laughter. Sophie froze beside me. Connor's jaw clenched. I took a sip of wine. It didn't help. He went on, oblivious or pretending to be. But every family needs balance, right? Some of us build cities, some of us plant flowers in them. The laughter swelled again, polite but cutting. And for that, he said with mock sincerity, I'm grateful. The applause that followed was scattered, uncertain. But it was enough. He'd said what he wanted to say. He'd reminded the world who the real builders were. Sophie's voice trembled. Olivia. Don't, I said quietly. He's still talking. He closed his speech with a toast. To family, to legacy, to knowing what it takes to build something real. The crowd lifted their glasses. I didn't. For a long moment I just sat there, my reflection trembling in the untouched champagne. The music swelled again, but all I heard was silence, the same silence that had followed me since childhood. Connor reached for my hand, his thumb brushing across my knuckles. "You don't have to sit through this," he murmured. "I do," I said, "because I need to remember how it feels. Exactly how it feels." When the crowd rose to mingle, I excused myself, walking toward the terrace doors. The night air was crisp, sharp with the scent of ocean salt and rain. I leaned against the railing, the city lights shimmering below like a second sky. Through the glass, I could see my father laughing with a group of executives, the picture of charm, and for the first time I didn't feel small watching him. I felt calm, calculated. Inside my clutch was a small silver box wrapped in navy ribbon. I ran my finger along its edge, feeling the weight of what I'd prepared, the proof of everything he refused to see. Tomorrow he would. And when he did, the foundation he stood on would finally crack. The moment I walked into the ballroom, time folded in on itself. The chandeliers gleamed just as they had that night, brilliant cold, merciless. The same marble floor, the same echo of expensive laughter. But this time, the banners didn't read Grant & Sons. They read, Bloomnest Sustainable Rebirth Official Partnership Gala. And this time, I wasn't a guest. I was the host. The concierge spotted me from across the lobby and immediately straightened his jacket. "Ms. Grant," he said, hurrying over with the kind of polite urgency reserved for royalty. "Everything is proceeding exactly as scheduled. The Horizon delegation has arrived, and your father's party just checked in." I gave a small nod. "Thank you. Please ensure the staff keeps the dinner service tight. And when my father arrives at the head table, make sure the place card reads, Guest of the Owner." "Yes, ma'am." He smiled, understanding the irony more than he probably should. Inside the ballroom, golden light poured across white linen tables. Waiters adjusted silver cutlery crystal glasses, catching reflections like tiny prisms. I glanced around, steadying my breath. Every inch of this place had been transformed, solar-powered lighting, reclaimed wood panels, vertical gardens climbing along the walls. My work, my team's vision. And yet beneath the hum of chatter and the clinking of glasses, a shadow still lingered. My father's voice from that night, mocking, amused, still haunted the air like smoke. "Doing that tiny business and calling it a company, when will you ever make money?" I looked up toward the mezzanine where journalists were setting up cameras. The press would be filming the Horizon signing tonight. It wasn't just a partnership announcement. It was the public unveiling of our flagship renovation. And my father, invited by Horizon, not by me, was about to witness every inch of it. Ms. Grant Priya approached elegant in a green dress that matched the Bloomnest palette. The guests are taking their seats. Horizon's CEO just asked if you'll open with a toast. Of course, I said, smoothing my dress. Let's give them something worth remembering. When I stepped onto the small stage, the hum of conversation softened. The lights caught the silver pendant at my neck, my mother's, and for a second, I could almost feel her hand on my shoulder. I took a breath. "Good evening, everyone," I began, voice steady. 2 years ago, this very ballroom hosted a farewell party for a man who taught me a lot about legacy, though not in the way he intended. A few guests chuckled softly, not sure if it was humor or warning. Back then, I continued. I sat at the end of this table, invisible, while someone I loved told a room full of people that my work would never amount to anything. Tonight we're here in the same room, but this time the work speaks for itself. Applause rippled through the room, polite at first, then genuine. I scanned the crowd until I found him, Harold Grant, sitting rigid at the center table, flanked by my brothers. His expression didn't shift, but his jaw tightened. "Bloomnest," I said. Letting the name linger was built on the belief that sustainability isn't a luxury, it's a responsibility. We don't just build hotels. We restore what others overlook. We turn waste into wonder. I raised my glass. To build what lasts. The crowd lifted their glasses in unison. Horizon's CEO, Claire Thompson, smiled warmly across the table. Cameras flashed. The moment was immortalized. And then, like a silent cue, the concierge approached our table, his timing almost poetic. "Ma'am," he said softly but audibly enough for the nearby guests to hear, "your staff is ready for the next phase of the program." He turned to my father and nodded respectfully. "Mr. Grant, it's an honor to have you here tonight as the guest of our owner." The word owner landed like thunder. Conversations faltered. Silverware still. My father blinked once, his confusion flickering for all to see. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice brittle. "Did you just say owner?" The concierge smiled. "Yes, sir. Ms. Grant is the principal owner and visionary of the Astoria Regent. Every element you see here, every detail is part of her firm's redevelopment." You could hear the silence stretch thick and electric. I turned toward him, calm and measured. "Surprise," I said quietly, though my smile didn't reach my eyes. My brothers shifted uncomfortably. Ethan coughed into his napkin. Michael stared at the tablecloth as if it might swallow him whole. Dad's color drained, but he tried to recover with a laugh. "Well," he said, forcing lightness into his tone, "you always had a flair for design, didn't you?" "It's more than design, Dad," I said, my voice steady but soft. "It's a vision. Business. Leadership. The things you once said I didn't have." He looked at me for a long moment. I saw the flicker in his eyes, the same stubborn pride that had defined his entire life. But behind it, something else. Recognition. Claire rose from her seat. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, drawing attention, "we'd like to thank Ms. Grant and her firm for leading one of the most successful sustainable renovations in our history. The Astoria Regent now runs on 90% renewable energy, employs over 200 local staff, and has already achieved full occupancy for the next 3 months." Applause burst through the room. Cameras flashed again. My father remained motionless, the noise washing over him. When it finally quieted, he leaned closer to me. His voice was low, rough. "You really own this?" "Yes," I said. "Every inch of it." "And the Horizon deal signed last week," I said. "They didn't want Grant and Sons. They wanted Bloomnest." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes clouded with something between disbelief and defeat. After the dinner, I found him alone on the balcony overlooking the city lights. The air was cool, the night stretching wide and quiet. "You know," he said without turning around, "I built half this skyline." "I know," I replied softly. "And now you're building the other half." For the first time, there was no sarcasm in his tone. Just the truth. He glanced over his shoulder. "You did it without my help." I met his gaze. "Because you never offered it." He nodded slowly. The city's lights shimmered across the reflection in his glass. "You were right to stay silent that night," he said finally. "And tonight, you didn't have to say a word at all." The room already knew. I let the silence hang between us, heavy and full. Below the hotel's lights glowed warm against the dark skyline, a living monument to every time I'd been told no. I turned toward the ballroom doors. "Good night, Dad." "Olivia," he said as I reached the threshold, "for what it's worth, I was wrong." The words landed like a benediction years too late. I smiled faintly without turning around. "I know." Inside, the music swelled again. Guests danced, laughed, and toasted. My world, once dismissed as a tiny business, was alive and thriving around me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need his approval to feel complete. 3 days after the gala, a package arrived at my office. It was from my father, no message, just a plain brown box. Inside was a miniature greenhouse I'd built at 13 for a science fair restored. He'd kept it. Beneath the model lay his note. He wrote that on the night of the ceremony, he saw everything he had refused to see. "I watched you stand in a room built by my arrogance and turn it into something beautiful. I thought I was teaching you strength by being hard on you, but I only taught you how to live without me." The letter confessed that he knew the model represented vision, and that my mother, Margaret, had seen it first. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to understand you before time runs out." I couldn't sleep. I drove to his mansion. His confidence was gone. "You can't fix 30 years with one letter," I said. He gave a faint, sad smile. No, but it's a start. He confessed he kept pushing me away because he saw too much of Margaret in me, and he was terrified of losing me too. I told him all I ever wanted was harmony. You can rebuild it, I said. That evening he emailed a blueprint, the Grant Community Initiative. Affordable green housing funded by a new foundation in Margaret's name. Would you help me make this real, your vision? My resources. For her. I replied with a single line, let's meet tomorrow morning at the office. Bring your sketches. The next day, he walked into Bloomnest's headquarters. My team still went. The office full of natural light and green vines looked surreal to him. This place breathes, he said quietly. Your mother would have loved it. We spread blueprints for the Margaret Grant Community Hub in Franklin, Ohio. We worked side by side arguing over sustainability, but the arguments were now about purpose. He learned to listen. He told me my grandfather was a lumberjack, admitting I was wrong about what matters. You're building softer. It lasts longer. At the groundbreaking ceremony, he stood beside me. I said, legacy isn't about skyscrapers, it's about roots. He took the mic impromptu. My daughter taught me that strength isn't in steel. It's on purpose. That evening, he admitted he was selling his penthouse. It's just glass and steel. I want to live somewhere that breathes. 2 days later, he gave me a final plaque. For Olivia Grant, who taught me that vision builds more than towers. For the first time, our worlds, his towers and my gardens, didn't feel separate. We'd built something together, a bridge between the ghosts. The following month was a blur of blueprint site meetings and long drives to Franklin. The community center had broken ground and construction hummed with a rhythm that felt almost sacred. My father came to every site inspection. He wore a hard hat like a man trying on humility for the first time. The crew respected him not because of who he used to be, but because of how he'd changed, asking questions instead of giving orders, listening more than speaking. One afternoon, as we stood at the edge of the property, watching the skeletal steel beams rise, he said quietly, "It's strange. I used to look at this kind of structure and think only about profit margins and deadlines. Now I see the people who'll walk through those doors. Kids' families. Maybe a young girl who wants to build her own world someday." I glanced at him. That's what Mom saw in every project I said. People first, profit second. He smiled faintly. She always had a better compass than I did. The breeze carried the scent of sawdust and wet soil. It felt different here, honest, grounded. For once, I wasn't trying to prove anything. We were simply building something together. Later that week, I stopped by his house to review the upcoming phase budgets. He'd sold the penthouse like he said he would, and the mansion felt emptier than ever. The walls were bare, the grand piano gone, the rooms echoing with a soft kind of peace instead of pride. He greeted me at the door with 2 mugs of coffee. "Don't laugh," he said, "but I've started using those compostable pods you gave me." I laughed anyway. Never thought I'd see the day. We sat in his study papers spread across the desk, but the conversation drifted away from finances. He looked at me thoughtfully. "Do you ever think about your mother?" "Every day," I said. "Especially when I'm building something new. She's always in it somewhere." He nodded, his gaze distant. "She used to write poetry, you know. I found one in her old journal last week. It said, 'A house is only as strong as the forgiveness it holds.' I didn't understand it until now." He handed me the faded page, his hands trembling slightly. I read the words in her looping handwriting and felt the weight of everything she'd tried to teach us: love, patience, compassion. She'd known we'd need this moment long before we ever got here. A few days later, I invited him to speak at a local business forum on sustainable development. He refused at first. "No one wants to hear from an old man who used to pave over green space." "They might," I said. "They need to see that people can change." He agreed reluctantly. The day of the forum, he stood behind the podium in his gray suit, no tie sleeves rolled up. When he began speaking, his voice carried not authority, but humility. "I spent most of my career thinking sustainability was a buzzword," he said. "But my daughter taught me that sustainability isn't just about the environment. It's about how we sustain relationships, communities, even our own humanity. The room was silent. Then slow applause spread, followed by a standing ovation. I caught his eye from the front row, and for a brief second, he looked like a man lighter than he'd been in decades. Afterward, he said quietly, "That felt good, different." "It's called being proud of the right things," I said. Weeks passed, and the community center began to take shape, a building of glass and green where sunlight filtered through solar-paneled skylights. Every time I walked through the site, workers greeted me with genuine smiles. They weren't just building a structure. They were building a symbol of reconciliation. One afternoon, my brother Michael showed up unexpectedly. "Dad told me you might need an extra hand," he said awkwardly. "I've been rethinking things." "About time," I teased. He chuckled. "You've always been better at this vision stuff. I'm just trying to keep up." We walked through the halls together, unfinished walls, the scent of paint still fresh. He stopped and said, "You know, I think Dad finally gets it. He's not the same man." "Neither am I," said quietly. That night, after everyone had gone, I found my father sitting alone on a stack of lumber, staring at the structure silhouetted against the sunset. The golden light caught in the wrinkles around his eyes. He looked fragile but peaceful. "I used to think forgiveness meant weakness," he said without turning around. "That meant losing control." "But it's the opposite, isn't it?" "Yes," I said, sitting beside him. "Forgiveness is control. It's choosing peace over pride." He nodded slowly. "Then I guess this place is our foundation. For what I asked. For everything we broke, and everything we can still rebuild." We sat in silence, the steel beams casting long shadows across the field. For once, silence didn't feel like distance. It felt like understanding. A week before the center's official opening, I received another package, this time a small wooden frame. Inside was a photograph I'd never seen before. My father and mother stood together at the groundbreaking of his first building, both smiling, both younger than I could remember. Beneath the photo, a note in my father's handwriting read, "For every foundation I laid in concrete, she laid one in love. You carry both." I placed the frame on my office desk beside the old model of my childhood greenhouse. 2 generations, 2 visions, finally connected. On the morning of this ribbon-cutting ceremony, my father and I stood before a crowd of families and local officials. The sign behind us shimmered in the sunlight. The Margaret Grant Community Hub, a Bloom Nest, and Grant Foundation project. When the mayor handed me the scissors, I paused, looking at my father. "You should do it," I said. He shook his head. "No kid. This one's yours." I smiled and cut the ribbon. Cheers erupted. Cameras flashed. My father's eyes glistened as the crowd surged forward to explore the new space. Inside, children ran through the open atrium, their laughter echoing off the sunlit walls. My father walked slowly behind them, his expression soft with awe. "She'd love this," he whispered. "She's here," I said. He nodded. "Yeah, she always was." That evening, after the guests had gone and the lights dimmed, we stood outside the building. The glass facade reflected the stars. The engraved plaque by the entrance caught the faint glow of the street lamps, built on forgiveness, guided by vision, dedicated to legacy. He reached out, resting his hand on the plaque. "You know," he said quietly, "I thought the proudest day of my life would be my retirement. But it's this one." I smiled, tears stinging my eyes. "Then maybe we're finally building the same thing." He looked at me for a long moment and said, "No, Olivia. You're building something better." We stood there, father and daughter, builder and designer, at the foundation of a new legacy. One made not of steel or power, but of understanding. And for the first time, I knew that forgiveness wasn't just something you give, it's something you live. The first winter after the center opened, Franklin looked different. The streets that had once felt forgotten were alive again, kids skating outside the new recreation wing, small businesses springing up around the square, laughter echoing from the after-school art programs that filled the hallways every evening. What used to be an empty field was now the heartbeat of a town, and every time I drove by the engraved sign with my mother's name, I felt something settle inside me. Dad visited the center almost every week. He'd traded his tailored suits for khakis and a worn leather jacket. Sometimes he'd sit with the kids during architecture workshops, asking questions, pretending to understand solar modeling software. They adored him, calling him Mr. H. One afternoon, I found him helping a little girl glue tiny paper trees onto a cardboard model. "See," he said, squinting through his reading glasses. "You've got to give the trees space to breathe. Otherwise, it won't look real." The girl grinned. "Like air for the planet." He laughed. "Exactly. Air for the planet." I stood in the doorway, watching the corners of my mouth lifting. It was like seeing a different version of him, a version my mother would have believed in all along. Later that day, we sat outside the cafe across from the center. He stirred his coffee, watching the sunset reflect off the building's glass walls. "You know," he said, "I thought I was too old to start over. Turns out, that's when you finally understand what starting over really means." I smiled. "You didn't start over, Dad. You just stopped running." He nodded, eyes softening. "Maybe. But you made me stop." Bloomnest was thriving. The Horizon Partnership had expanded into 7 countries, each project rooted in sustainable architecture and community renewal. I'd spent most of my 30s proving myself to the world, but now I was learning to live in what I'd built. One morning, Priya burst into my office holding a magazine. "You made Architectural Digest's Women Shaping the Future list," she said, waving it like a trophy. I laughed. "That's a mouthful." "Look," she said, reading aloud. "Olivia Grant, founder of Bloomnest Studios, the firm redefining modern legacy architecture." I chuckled. Legacy architecture. I like that. But what struck me most wasn't the recognition, it was the timing. The article mentioned the community hub and quoted my father's speech from the ribbon-cutting ceremony. He'd said, "The best legacies aren't inherited, they're rebuilt." For the first time, I realized that both of us had finally built something worthy of carrying forward. A month later, I received an invitation from the mayor of Franklin. The city was naming a street after my mother, Margaret Grant Way. The ceremony would be small, intimate. When I told my father, he just stared at the letter for a moment before saying, "She would have teased me for not getting one first." At the ceremony, the air was crisp with early spring. Families gathered along the new road leading to the center, the one lined with flowering trees. The mayor gave a short speech about education, art, and resilience, then handed the microphone to my father. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Margaret believed in beauty you could feel, not just see," he said. "She believed that every building, every person had a purpose. I spent too many years building walls, and she spent her life tearing them down. I think she'd be proud to know we finally met in the middle." When he stepped back, the crowd applauded. He caught my eye and smiled faintly. "Your turn," he mouthed. I took the stage. "This street," I said, "isn't just for my mother. It's for anyone who's ever been told they were too small to build something that mattered. It's for every daughter who has to carve her own foundation." The sign was unveiled, white letters gleaming against the blue sky. Margaret Grant Way. My father reached for my hand and squeezed it. "We did good," he whispered. That evening we returned to New York together. In the car, he gazed out the window, quiet for most of the drive. As we reached the city skyline, he said, "You know, I used to see this view as proof of my success. Now it feels more like a reminder of what I asked, that everything grand starts small, even towers need seeds." We stopped at a red light. He turned to me. "When I'm gone, promise me something." I frowned. "Don't start talking like that." He smiled. "Promise me you'll keep building for people. Not profits, not pride." "I already am," I said. "I know," he replied. "Just don't let the world change that." The light turned green and traffic surged forward, but his words stayed with me. 2 weeks later, I found him in his study again, sketching. "What are you working on?" I asked. He looked up, sheepish. "Just an idea. A senior housing complex powered entirely by solar. Affordable, accessible, something your mom would have liked. I leaned over his shoulder, smiling. You're designing again. He shrugged. Maybe. With a little help. You'll get it, I said. But only if you promise to let me be the boss. He laughed. Deal. We spent that afternoon sketching together like we had when I was a teenager, when he still thought my blueprints were daydreams. Except now he was listening, asking, learning. As the sun set through the window, he set his pencil down. You know, he said, I think this is what she wanted all along. Not for us to forgive each other, but to build together. I looked at him and nodded. We're getting there. By summer, the Franklin Hub had become a model project replicated in 3 more cities. My father traveled to each groundbreaking, shaking hands, smiling in photographs, his humility becoming something of a legend in the business press. But to me, he was just Dad again, flawed human, finally free. One night after a long day of site visits, we stood at the rooftop garden of the New York Bloom Nest office. The city glowed below us, lights shimmering against the glass. He leaned on the railing, breathing deeply. This is what you always saw, isn't it? A living city. Not just buildings. I smiled. Exactly. He exhaled a faint smile, tugging at his lips. I used to think power came from owning things, but it's this creating something that outlives you. That's real power. He turned to me, then his eyes reflecting the city lights. I don't say this enough, but I'm proud of you, Olivia. Not because you proved me wrong, because you proved yourself right. I felt tears welling up, but I just nodded. Thanks, Dad. When he left that night, I stood alone under the stars. The skyline stretched wide and endless, filled with both his towers and my gardens. For the first time, they didn't look like opposites. They looked like one-story hours. We hadn't rewritten history. We'd rebuilt it. And as I watched the lights shimmer across the horizon, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was the legacy worth leaving behind. The last project we worked on together wasn't supposed to be his. It started as a simple collaboration, another community renewal in Cleveland, the city, where he'd built his first warehouse 40 years ago. But something about that site drew him in. He spent hours sketching designs, reworking layouts, arguing with me about skylight angles and energy grids. He said he wanted it to be the full circle. I didn't realize he meant it literally. The night before construction began, he called me. I've been thinking, he said, his voice steady but quieter than usual. When we finish this, I think I'm ready to slow down. I smiled into the phone. You said that after Franklin. This time I mean it. He paused, then added, You know that model you made when you were 13, the greenhouse? Of course. I used to think it was cute, he said softly. Now I think it was prophetic. I laughed. You're starting to sound like Mom. I hope so, he said. She was always the one who saw the future. That was our last conversation. A week later, he collapsed at the Cleveland site. A heart attack. Quick, the doctor said. Peaceful, they said. But there was nothing peaceful about standing beside his hospital bed, holding a hand that had built so much, and realizing it would never move again. He'd left a note for me, typed folded neatly in his wallet. I couldn't bring myself to read it for days. When I finally did, the words blurred through tears. Liv, if you're reading this, I didn't make it to the ribbon cutting. That's all right. It was never about the building, it was about the bridge between us. You finished it the moment we forgave each other. Keep building things that breathe. I'll see you in every sunrise that hits your glass walls. Dad. The weeks after his funeral passed in a strange kind of quiet. Everyone wanted to talk about his accomplishments, his empire, his legacy. No one seemed to understand that his greatest achievement wasn't in steel or glass. It was the moment he looked at me and saw me as his equal. Michael's reaction was swift and predictable: rage, then retreat. The rapid decline of Grant & Sons, hastened by the loss of the Horizon deals, became his burden. He called me once not to mourn, but to accuse me of engineering the company's downfall. You got what you wanted, he sneered. The whole empire. I simply told him the truth. I wanted freedom, Michael. You wanted control. And control built on a shaky foundation always falls. He hung up. I never heard from him again, though later news showed he'd sold his shares and moved to an island trading skyscrapers for silence. Ethan, the quiet brother, was different. 2 months after Dad's passing, he came to my office. He didn't offer condolences. He offered a document. "Grant & Sons is officially dissolving," he said, his voice low. Dad signed the paperwork right after the gala, transferring all liquid assets and remaining properties to the new foundation. He told me to keep it quiet until after the retirement party. He didn't want his legacy to be a crumbling empire, but a new beginning. He paused. "I knew what you were doing. I helped delay Michael on some of those bids. It was the only way to help you both." Ethan, the silent ally, had chosen purpose over pride, too. He didn't want the power. He just wanted out. He joined a nonprofit focusing on urban renewal data, a quiet analyst finally finding his own green space. The Cleveland project became mine alone. I worked on it day and night, not to fill the silence, but to honor it. Every line I drew, every beam I approved, carried his handwriting somewhere within it. He'd wanted to name it the Renewal Complex, but I renamed it the Harold Grant Commons. When it finally opened, the mayor called it a blueprint for the city's future. I stood at the podium in front of the crowd, the late afternoon sun casting long golden shadows. The wind caught my hair as I looked out over the building's curved glass. This place, I said, was built on vision, forgiveness, and time. 3 things my father taught me, though not always on purpose. He used to tell me that buildings should stand as proof of a man's power. But what I learned from him in the end is that the most powerful thing you can build is peace. The applause swelled around me, but I barely heard it. For a moment I felt his familiar presence beside me, hands in his pockets, that proud, crooked smile. After the ceremony, I walked through the halls alone. Each room had been designed for light open spaces, green walls, quiet corners for people to breathe. In the main atrium, a plaque hung on the wall. I hadn't approved its wording, but when I saw it, my throat tightened. For Harold and Margaret Grant, who taught us that the truest legacy is love rebuilt. I reached out, brushing my fingers over the engraved names. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to prove anything. The war was over. The silence between us had become peace. Outside kids were already playing in the courtyard, their laughter carrying as the day darkened. A mother sat under a tree reading. A young architect was explaining to a group of interns how the solar panels redirected rainwater into the gardens. It was exactly what we'd imagined life breathing inside design. That evening I drove back to the hotel where I was staying, the same hotel where it had all started years ago. The Astoria Regent. The place where humiliation had once burned through me like fire. But now as I walked through the lobby, I didn't feel bitterness. The chandeliers still sparkled. The marble floor still gleamed. The staff still greeted me with the same warmth and respect. I passed the ballroom doors and paused, staring inside. A corporate dinner was underway, laughter spilling across the room. For a second, I saw myself from years ago sitting small at that table, pretending the pain didn't matter. I smiled faintly. She'd survived. She'd become someone her father finally recognized. I walked farther in, tracing my hand along the wall where the manager had once said, "Ma'am, your staff is ready for your instructions." That moment had changed everything. It was the night I stopped asking for approval and started claiming ownership of my story. I whispered under my breath, "We did it, Dad." Back in my room, I sat on the balcony overlooking the city. The skyline shimmered quietly under the dusk, alive with both of our legacies, his towers reaching high, my gardens woven between them. For years I'd thought we were opposites. Now I saw we'd been 2 halves of the same vision he built for permanence. I built for possibility. The night breeze was cool. Somewhere below, a busker played a saxophone, the sound carrying through the streets. I leaned back in my chair, letting it wash over me. On the table beside me lay his notebook found in his study after he passed. Inside, I'd discovered sketches of unfinished designs, rough lines accompanied by notes written in his handwriting. One page stood out. It read, "The Bloom Nest philosophy, not to conquer the world, but to grow it. Olivia's way." Our way. I closed the notebook, my chest tightening, but not from grief, from gratitude. Years later, Bloomnest and the Grant Foundation merged into one organization, an alliance that focused on sustainable urban renewal across the country. People began calling it the Grant Legacy Movement. It wasn't about fame, it was about continuation. At every opening ceremony, I still said the same words: we don't just build buildings, we build the spaces where forgiveness can live. And somewhere in those crowds, I always imagined my parents watching my mother with her warm eyes, my father with that reluctant smile. Sometimes late at night, I return to Franklin. I sit outside the Margaret Grant Community Hub under the solar lights we installed years ago and listen to the hum of life inside. The laughter, the classes, the footsteps echoing through the halls. It's alive, just like we promised it would be. And every time I look at the engraved words on the wall, built on forgiveness, guided by vision, dedicated to legacy, I understand that the story was never just about revenge. It was about reclamation, about taking back the narrative and turning pain into purpose. If you've ever been underestimated, laughed at, or told your dreams were too small, remember this: the greatest revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's becoming everything they were too blind to see. So keep building, keep forgiving, keep turning what hurts you into what heals others. Because sometimes the most beautiful blueprints are drawn from the cracks, and they last forever.